Did you know that Napoleon Bonaparte was actually taller than the average Frenchman of his time? That's right, the idea that he was a tiny, angry general is one of history's most persistent myths. We've all heard it, maybe even repeated it, but it's completely false. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. History is full of stories we think we know, facts we swear are true, only to find out they're nothing more than misunderstandings, exaggerations, or flat-out fabrications. Some of these myths are harmless, but others have shaped how we see entire civilizations, leaders, and pivotal moments in time. Why do these misconceptions stick around? Sometimes it's because they make a better story. Other times it's because the truth gets buried under centuries of repetition. But here's the thing, once you start pulling at these threads, history becomes even more fascinating because the real story is often stranger, more surprising, and way more interesting than the version we've been told. Think about how many times you've heard that Vikings wore horned helmets. It's everywhere: movies, cartoons, even sports logos. But archaeologists have never found a single Viking helmet with horns. Not one. The myth was actually popularized by a 19th century opera costume designer who thought it looked cool. And just like that, a whole culture got misrepresented for generations. That's the power of a good story. It can rewrite history in our minds without us even realizing it. From Cleopatra's beauty to the flat earth myth, these misconceptions aren't just trivial mistakes. They shape how we understand the past, and in some cases, they even influence how we see ourselves today. So what happens when we start unraveling these myths? We get to see history with fresh eyes. Suddenly, the past isn't just a collection of dry facts, it's alive, messy, and full of surprises. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're going to explore 30 of the most stubborn historical misconceptions, the ones that refuse to go away no matter how many times they're debunked. Some will make you laugh, others might make you question what else you've been taught, and a few might even change how you think about the world. Because history isn't just about dates and names, it's about the stories we tell, the truths we overlook, and the myths that somehow outlast the facts. Ready to see how much of what you know is actually wrong? Let's get started. That iconic image of a Viking, fierce, bearded, and of course, sporting a pair of dramatic horns on his helmet, is burned into our collective imagination. But here's the twist, it's pure fantasy. Real Viking helmets, according to every single archaeological find we've ever uncovered, were smooth, rounded, and designed for practicality, not theatrical flair. So where did the horns come from? Blame the 19th century obsession with romanticizing the past. A costume designer for an 1876 opera about Norse gods decided horns would make the characters look more imposing and exotic. The audience loved it, artists copied it, and before long the myth was set in stone, despite zero historical evidence. The truth is, Viking warriors valued function over fashion. Their helmets were made of iron or leather, designed to deflect blows, not catch them on decorative protrusions. Imagine trying to charge into battle with giant horns sticking out of your head. You'd be a walking target, snagging on branches or giving your enemy an easy handle to yank you to the ground. Even the few surviving Viking helmets we have, like the one found in Debunkt, Norway, are simple, close-fitting designs with eye guards for extra protection. No horns, no wings, no dramatic flourishes, just sturdy gear built to keep a warrior alive. Yet the myth persists, popping up in everything from football team logos to blockbuster movies. It's a perfect example of how pop culture can rewrite history, turning a practical piece of armor into a cartoonish symbol. And once a misconception takes root, it's incredibly hard to uproot. But the real story of Viking helmets is far more interesting than the myth. These were the tools of explorers, traders, and yes, sometimes raiders who relied on clever engineering, not flashy accessories. So next time you see a horned helmet in a show or game, you'll know the Vikings would have laughed at the idea. They were too busy changing the world to worry about looking like theatrical villains. Napoleon Bonaparte's height is one of history's most enduring tall tales, pun fully intended. The image of a furious, pint-sized dictator stomping across Europe has been etched into popular culture, but the truth is far less dramatic. Standing at 5 feet 7 inches, Napoleon was actually slightly taller than the average Frenchman of his era. So how did this larger-than-life figure become the poster child for short man syndrome? Blame a mix of British propaganda and a simple misunderstanding of units. When British cartoonists and newspapers wanted to paint Napoleon as a petty, insignificant tyrant, they leaned hard into the idea of his supposed diminutiveness. Satirical illustrations exaggerated his size, depicting him as a child-sized tantrum thrower next to towering British generals. But the real kicker, the confusion over French versus British measurements. French inches were slightly longer than British ones, so when reports of Napoleon's height crossed the Channel, his 5'2" in French units was mistakenly read as 5'2" in British units, shaving off a full 5 inches from his actual stature. The myth stuck, fueled by the British public's eagerness to mock their adversary. What's fascinating is how this stereotype outlived the politics of the time. The idea of Napoleon as a tiny, overcompensating conqueror fit neatly into psychological theories and pop culture tropes. Even today, the term Napoleon complex persists, describing shorter men who supposedly act more aggressively to make up for their height. Yet historians have found zero evidence Napoleon was insecure about his stature. If anything, his confidence was towering. He surrounded himself with elite guards who were required to be taller than average, not to compensate for his own height, but to create an imposing presence for his regime. The irony, many of the monarchs and generals who mocked Napoleon were actually shorter than he was. King Frederick William III of Prussia, for example, stood at just 5 feet 5 inches, while Austrian Emperor Francis I barely cleared 5 feet 4. But history remembers Napoleon as the short one because the caricature served a narrative. It's a reminder that even the smallest myths can cast long shadows, especially when they're weaponized by propaganda. So next time someone jokes about Napoleon's height, you'll know the man wasn't short. The story about him was just cut down to size. One of the most stubborn myths about human engineering is that the Great Wall of China is the only man-made structure visible from space. It sounds impressive, a 2,000-year-old marvel so vast it can be seen from orbit, but here's the reality. Astronauts confirm it's nearly impossible to spot with the naked eye, and there's a simple reason why. From low Earth orbit, the wall's muted, earth-toned stones blend seamlessly into the natural landscape, making it no more distinguishable than a single thread laid across a sprawling carpet. The myth likely took hold because early 20th century writers exaggerated the wall's scale, and the idea stuck after all. It's a poetic notion that humanity's grandest ancient project could be seen from the heavens. But in reality, the Great Wall averages just 25 feet wide, far too narrow to stand out against the vast terrain. Even from the International Space Station, which orbits at 250 miles up, spotting it would be like trying to identify a single strand of spaghetti from the top of the Empire State Building. What's fascinating is that modern cities, with their sprawling networks of bright lights, are far more visible from space than ancient stonework. Astronauts often describe seeing urban areas as glowing patches against the darkness, while the Great Wall remains elusive. The only way to catch a glimpse, specialized camera lenses or satellite imagery, not the naked eye. This misconception reveals how easily romantic ideas can overshadow facts. The Great Wall is undeniably a staggering achievement, stretching over 13,000 miles. But its true marvel lies in the labor of millions, the centuries of history embedded in its stones, not in an exaggerated claim about visibility. So next time someone says it's visible from space, you'll know the truth. The wall's greatness doesn't need mythical status. Its real story, endurance, ingenuity, and sheer human determination is far more extraordinary. Here's something you've probably heard 1,000 times. Medieval folks believed the Earth was flat, and it took brave explorers like Columbus to prove them wrong. But what if I told you that's complete nonsense? The idea that educated people in the Middle Ages thought the world was flat is actually a myth invented centuries later. In reality, scholars from that era knew perfectly well the Earth was round, a fact they inherited from ancient Greek astronomers like Pythagoras and Aristotle, whose works were carefully preserved and studied. So where did this flat Earth myth come from? Blame 19th century writers like Washington Irving, the same man who gave us the legend of Sleepy Hollow. In his fictionalized biography of Christopher Columbus, Irving painted medieval Europeans as superstitious simpletons who feared Columbus's ships would sail off the edge of the world. It made for a dramatic story, but it was pure invention. The truth is, by Columbus's time, the Earth's roundness was common knowledge among educated people. Medieval universities taught spherical Earth theory, and sailors navigated using calculations based on its curvature. Even the Catholic Church, often falsely accused of suppressing scientific progress, accepted the Earth's round shape. After all, early Christian thinkers like Augustine and Bede had written about it centuries before. The real credit for preserving this knowledge goes to a mix of cultures. Islamic scholars translated and expanded on Greek texts during the Golden Age of Islam, while European monks copied and studied these works in their monasteries. By the time Columbus set sail, educated people weren't debating whether the Earth was round, they were arguing about its size. Columbus himself underestimated the planet's circumference, which is why he thought he'd reached Asia when he stumbled upon the Americas. What's fascinating is how this myth took hold. In the 1800s, the idea of a dark age of ignorance became popular, with writers using the flat Earth story as shorthand for medieval backwardness. It fit a narrative of progress, casting modern science as the hero overcoming ancient superstition. But the irony, the real medieval world was far more sophisticated than we give it credit for. Scholars debated the Earth's circumference, not its shape, and even calculated it with surprising accuracy. So next time someone claims people thought the Earth was flat until Columbus came along, you'll know the truth. The Middle Ages weren't so dark after all. The real myth isn't about the shape of the Earth, it's about how easily we underestimate the past. Christopher Columbus discovering America is one of history's most stubborn myths, and here's why: he wasn't even close to being the first. Long before his ships landed in the Caribbean in 1492, the Americas were already home to thriving civilizations, from the Aztec and Inca empires to the complex societies of the Mississippian culture. But more surprising, Europeans had actually reached the continent centuries earlier. Viking explorer Leif Erikson established a short-lived settlement in Newfoundland around the year 1000, a fact confirmed by archaeological evidence at Elance Orcs Meadows. And that's just the beginning. Polynesian voyagers likely made contact with South America long before Columbus, bringing back sweet potatoes, a crop native to the Americas, to Pacific islands by at least the 1200s. Indigenous oral histories from places like Peru and Chile also speak of encounters with distant seafarers. So why does Columbus get all the credit? Blame 19th century American mythmaking. As the United States sought national heroes, Columbus was reinvented as a bold pioneer, despite the fact he never set foot on mainland North America. His voyages were focused on the Caribbean and Central America, where his actions, enslavement, violence, and disease transmission devastated indigenous populations. The real story is far messier than the sanitized version taught in schools. Columbus didn't discover a new world. He stumbled into a hemisphere already crisscrossed by trade routes, diplomacy, and warfare among indigenous nations. The Maya, for example, had sprawling cities with astronomical observatories while Europe was still crawling out of the Middle Ages. Even Columbus's own writings reveal his confusion. He died convinced he'd reached Asia, never realizing his true geographical blunder. What's fascinating is how this myth persists despite overwhelming evidence. Textbooks still frame his arrival as a turning point, overshadowing millennia of indigenous history. The truth, Columbus's legacy isn't one of discovery, but of collision, a moment that set off waves of suffering and transformation. Recognizing that doesn't erase history, it forces us to see it clearly. So next time you hear Columbus discovered America, remember, the real story isn't about who got there first, it's about whose stories we choose to tell. The so-called Dark Ages weren't actually dark at all unless you count the dim lighting in candlelit monasteries where monks were busy preserving priceless knowledge. This misnamed period, roughly between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, gets a bad rap as a time of backwardness and ignorance. But peel back the layers of myth, and you'll find an era buzzing with innovation, scholarship, and cultural exchange. Far from a stagnant void, this was a time when the foundations of modern Europe were being laid brick by brick, book by book. Take education, for example. While Hollywood loves to depict medieval Europe as a land of illiterate peasants, the reality was far more sophisticated. The first universities, Bologna, Oxford, Paris, were born in the Middle Ages, becoming hubs of law, medicine, and philosophy. Scholars pored over not just religious texts but also rediscovered works by Aristotle, Euclid, and Ptolemy, often thanks to Arabic translations that had preserved classical knowledge during Islam's golden age. And let's not forget Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century polymath who wrote treatises on everything from cosmology to herbal medicine, while composing some of the era's most hauntingly beautiful music. Then there's the technology. This was the age of the heavy plow, a revolutionary tool that turned dense northern soils into fertile farmland, fueling population growth. Windmills began dotting the landscape, harnessing nature's energy to grind grain and pump water. Gothic cathedrals, with their soaring arches and stained glass, weren't just religious symbols. They were marvels of engineering, pushing the limits of physics and artistry. The notion that everyone was huddling in mud huts ignores the bustling trade routes, from the Silk Road to Viking trade networks, that connected continents and sparked cultural cross-pollination. Even the term Dark Ages is a misnomer coined by Renaissance thinkers eager to glorify their own era by painting the past as primitive. Petrarch and later Enlightenment writers framed the Middle Ages as a bleak interlude between the brilliance of antiquity and their own enlightened times. But this narrative erases the vibrant intellectual life of medieval Europe, where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars debated in Spain's translation schools, where Byzantine libraries safeguarded ancient texts, and where inventions like eyeglasses and mechanical clocks began reshaping daily life. The truth, the Middle Ages were anything but stagnant. They were a crucible of ideas, a bridge between antiquity and modernity. So next time someone dismisses this era as backward, remember, the light of knowledge never truly went out. It just flickered in different corners, waiting to ignite the spark of the Renaissance. And that's a story far more illuminating than the myth of darkness. When we picture the Salem witch trials, many of us envision screaming women tied to stakes as flames lick at their feet. A dramatic image burned into our collective memory by movies and Halloween decorations. But here's the unsettling truth: no one was burned at the stake in Salem. Every single one of the 20 people executed during that infamous hysteria met their end at the end of a rope, not in a blaze of fire. The confusion comes from mixing up witch hunts across time and place, blending Salem's story with Europe's far deadlier and more brutal crackdowns on so-called witchcraft. The difference boils down to legal traditions. In 17th century New England, the Puritan colonists followed English common law, which reserved burning as a punishment for specific crimes like treason or heresy, not witchcraft. Hanging was the standard fate for those convicted of consorting with the devil. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, countries like Germany and France were executing accused witches by the thousands, often through fire. The infamous Bamberg witch trials alone saw around 600 burnings between 1626 and 1631. These continental executions were rooted in different legal codes and religious fervor, creating a grisly contrast to Salem's comparatively smaller-scale tragedy. So how did the burning myth take hold? Blame pop culture's love for visual spectacle. Flames are dramatic, they make for gripping movie scenes and haunting illustrations. The image of a witch at the stake has become shorthand for the entire concept of witch hunts, erasing the quieter, but no less horrifying, reality of Salem's gallows. Even historical art often gets it wrong, superimposing European methods onto American events. The truth is, Salem's executions were chillingly methodical. Convicted individuals were marched to a place called Gallows Hill, where noosed ropes awaited them. Some, like elderly Giles Corey, faced even slower torment, pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. What's especially revealing is how this misconception overshadows the real horror of Salem. The tragedy wasn't just in how these people died, but in why they were accused in the first place. Many victims were marginalized figures, outsiders like Tituba, an enslaved indigenous woman, or Sarah Good, a homeless beggar. Others were simply outspoken women who defied social norms. The trials weren't about fire and brimstone, they were about fear, power, and the crushing weight of conformity. By correcting this myth, we don't downplay the suffering, we spotlight the historical nuances that make Salem's story so cautionary. It wasn't medieval barbarism, it was neighbor turning on neighbor in a calculated, courtroom-sanctioned frenzy. And that's a truth far more haunting than any Hollywood fire. Marie Antoinette never actually uttered those infamous 4 words, "Let them eat cake." The phrase that became shorthand for aristocratic indifference was pinned on her long after her death, a perfect piece of revolutionary propaganda to paint the doomed queen as heartless and out of touch. The truth, the quote predates her by decades, appearing in philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau's writings when Marie Antoinette was just a child. He attributed it to an unnamed princess, but by the time the French Revolution gained steam, protesters eagerly grafted it onto the most visible symbol of royal excess. What makes this myth so sticky isn't just its dramatic flair, it's how neatly it fit the narrative. France was starving, bread prices were skyrocketing, and the Austrian-born queen became an easy target for public fury. Yet historical letters reveal a far more complex figure. During the flour shortage of 1789, Marie Antoinette actually wrote to her family about the suffering of the poor, expressing genuine concern. She even suggested selling royal tableware to fund grain imports, though her efforts were too little, too late to counter the avalanche of resentment. The real irony, the Queen's supposed quote about cake would have made no sense in context. Brioche, a slightly richer bread, was likely the original phrase, not cake, since the French masses wouldn't have dreamed of actual dessert during famine. But nuance doesn't fuel revolutions. The myth stuck precisely because it reduced a messy historical moment to a single damning soundbite, erasing the Queen's real faults, her gambling debts, her political meddling, in favor of a cartoonish villain. Even the visual cliché of Marie Antoinette in towering wigs and extravagant gowns obscures a deeper truth. By the time of the Revolution, she'd adopted simpler fashions, trying to rehabilitate her image. But it didn't matter. The people had their scapegoat, and history got its perfect morality tale. The tone-deaf royal gorging on sweets while her subjects starved. The fact that it's all fabrication, that just proves how powerfully stories can rewrite reality, especially when they feed our hunger for poetic justice. The Iron Maiden, that spiked, human-shaped coffin of nightmares, is one of history's most chilling symbols of medieval cruelty. But here's the twist, this so-called torture device didn't actually exist in the Middle Ages. Not a single shred of evidence, no court records, no eyewitness accounts, no archaeological find supports its use before the 19th century. So how did this macabre myth take hold? Blame a mix of overactive imaginations and clever marketing by museum curators looking to spice up their exhibits. The first known Iron Maiden appeared in 18th century Germany, cobbled together from mismatched pieces of armor and embellished with spikes for dramatic effect. By the 1800s, Gothic novelists and sensationalist historians latched onto the idea, weaving lurid tales of victims being slowly impaled inside the contraption. The problem: these stories were pure fiction, often based on misreadings of medieval artifacts. For example, some historians point to ancient spike-lined punishment barrels described in texts, but these were likely metaphorical or exaggerated accounts, not blueprints for real devices. Even the famous Nuremberg Iron Maiden, long touted as an authentic medieval relic, was later proven to be a theatrical prop assembled centuries after the fact. What's fascinating is how this fabrication played into Victorian-era stereotypes about the barbaric Middle Ages. The Iron Maiden became shorthand for the supposed savagery of the past, reinforcing the idea that medieval Europe was a lawless playground of unchecked torture. In reality, most documented medieval torture methods were far simpler: racks, thumbscrews, and the dreaded strappado, where victims were hoisted by their wrists behind their backs. These were brutal enough without the need for elaborate spike-filled closets. The myth's staying power reveals more about modern anxieties than medieval practices. The Iron Maiden is a perfect villain, a cold, mechanical monster that turns punishment into a spectacle. It's no coincidence that the myth bloomed during the Industrial Revolution, when people were both fascinated and terrified by machines. The device became a metaphor for the dehumanizing power of technology, a fear we still project onto the past. So next time you see an Iron Maiden in a museum or movie, remember, it's not a relic of medieval cruelty. It's a relic of 19th century storytelling, proof that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we invent ourselves. The idea that the Library of Alexandria went up in flames all at once, a single catastrophic inferno wiping out the ancient world's greatest repository of knowledge, is one of history's most tragic oversimplifications. The truth: the library's demise was a slow unraveling, a victim of neglect, political turmoil, and a series of smaller disasters stretched over centuries. While Julius Caesar often takes the blame for setting the library ablaze during his siege of Alexandria in 48 BC, the reality is far messier and far more revealing about how institutions crumble not with a bang but with a whimper. Let's start with Caesar's fire. Yes, his troops did accidentally torch part of the city's harbor district, including warehouses that may have contained scrolls. But historians like Plutarch clarify that the main library complex attached to the royal palace likely survived this incident. The bigger blow came from gradual decay. By the time Caesar arrived, the library was already past its peak, suffering from funding cuts and shifting priorities under later Ptolemaic rulers. Think of it like a modern university losing grants slowly. Its collections stopped growing, its scholars drifted away, and its halls grew quieter. Then came the 3rd century AD, when Emperor Aurelian's troops sacked Alexandria during a civil war. This time, the library's annex in the Temple of Serapis was ransacked, scattering or destroying countless texts. But even then, the institution wasn't fully erased. Scholars continued teaching in Alexandria for generations, piecing together remnants of its collections. The final death knell: Christian riots in the 4th century targeting pagan sites, followed by an order from Caliph Omar in the 7th century, though that story is more legend than fact. What's fascinating is how the myth of a single, fiery end persists. It's a more dramatic story, a defining moment of loss, like the burning of Atlanta in Gone with the Wind. But the library's real decline mirrors how knowledge fades in the real world. Not in one heroic last stand, but through bureaucratic neglect, ideological shifts, and the quiet erosion of support. Scrolls crumbled from lack of upkeep or were repurposed as scrap parchment. Others simply languished unread as tastes changed, their wisdom fading into obscurity. The lesson here isn't just about Alexandria, it's about how we remember and misunderstand the fragility of knowledge. We imagine catastrophe as a sudden fire when more often it's a slow drip. The library didn't vanish in a day. It was chipped away scroll by scroll until one day people realized it was gone, and that's a warning worth remembering. Think of the classic pilgrim image: somber black outfits, stiff white collars, and those iconic buckled hats. It's a look stamped onto every Thanksgiving decoration and school play costume. But here's the surprise: not a single historical account or artifact from the Mayflower era actually supports this drab wardrobe. The real pilgrims dressed in earthy reds, deep greens, and even soft purples, with clothing that reflected their trades and social status far more than any rigid uniformity. So where did the gloomy, buckle-laden stereotype come from? Fast forward 2 centuries to the 1800s, when artists and writers romanticized the pilgrims as austere pioneers of American virtue. The buckles, in particular, were pure 19th century invention, a decorative flourish added to hats and shoes by painters like Henry Sargent, who sought to make the pilgrims look more old-fashioned to contemporary audiences. By the time Thanksgiving became a national holiday in 1863, the myth was set in stone. Printmakers and illustrators doubled down on the black and white simplicity, erasing the vibrant reality of 17th century fashion. Dig into surviving wills and estate inventories from Plymouth Colony, and you'll find fabrics listed in colors like russet, goose turd green, and peas porridge tawny. These weren't the muted tones of Puritan repression. They were practical dyes derived from local plants and imported goods. Even the famous white collars were often actually lace or linen trimmed with delicate embroidery. And those buckles, metal accessories, were expensive luxuries in the 1600s, more likely worn by wealthy merchants than by farmers and exiles scraping by in a new world. The deeper irony: the pilgrims' actual clothing would have scandalized the very Victorians who fossilized their image. Many wore leather breeches, brightly knitted stockings, and doublets in shades that modern reenactors have painstakingly recreated from fabric fragments. Women's dresses featured decorative stitching and layered petticoats, a far cry from the shapeless black gowns of folklore. Even children's clothes burst with color: madder red caps, ochre yellow aprons, proof that life in early America wasn't the monochrome struggle we imagine. Why does this myth matter? Because it turns real people into cardboard cutouts, flattening their complexity into a symbol. The pilgrims weren't a uniform group of solemn saints. They were individuals with preferences, personalities, and a surprising flair for fashion. When we strip away the layers of myth, we see them not as props in a Thanksgiving pageant, but as human beings who navigated an uncertain world, sometimes in stylish green doublets. And that's a history worth remembering, buckles optional. Albert Einstein flunking math class is one of those feel-good myths that just won't die. The idea that history's most brilliant physicist was once a struggling student, only to rise above his early failures through sheer genius. It's a comforting story, especially for anyone who's ever felt underestimated. But here's the problem: it's completely untrue. Einstein's school records tell a very different story. By age 12, he was already mastering calculus and philosophical concepts far beyond his years. So how did this narrative about his academic shortcomings take root? The answer lies in a mix of misinterpretation, creative storytelling, and our collective love for an underdog tale. The myth likely stems from a single, misread detail: Einstein's frustration with the rigid, authoritarian teaching style of his Munich school. He clashed with instructors who valued rote memorization over creative thinking, and by his own account, he felt stifled by the system. But that's not the same as struggling academically. In fact, when his family moved to Italy, a young Einstein wrote an essay so advanced that his examiner remarked it displayed exceptional logical clarity. Later, at 16, he aced the entrance exams for Zurich's Polytechnic School, except in French, a subject he openly admitted neglecting. Even then, his math and physics scores were so impressive that he was admitted despite the language shortfall. The transformation of Einstein into a failed student seems to have gained traction in the mid-20th century, long after his theories had reshaped modern physics. Biographers and journalists, eager to humanize the iconic scientist, latched onto anecdotes about his rebellious streak and disdain for authority, twisting them into a narrative of early academic struggle. The myth was further cemented by a widely circulated but fabricated quote, often attributed to Einstein himself, declaring, "I never failed in mathematics." In reality, he never said it. The quote was likely invented to debunk the very myth it now ironically perpetuates. What's fascinating is how this distortion reflects our cultural obsession with redemption arcs. We want our geniuses to have overcome adversity, to have triumphed against the odds. The truth that Einstein was precociously gifted from the start somehow feels less inspiring than the idea of a misfit who defied expectations. But the real story is far more revealing. Einstein's brilliance wasn't in spite of his education. It was fueled by an insatiable curiosity that chafed against rigid systems. He taught himself advanced mathematics from textbooks during summer vacations, devoured philosophy in his spare time, and constantly questioned the assumptions his teachers took for granted. By the time he published his groundbreaking papers in 1905, the same year he earned his doctorate, his former instructors were scrambling to claim credit for his genius. The very system he'd rebelled against now wanted to claim him as its product. That's the real irony. Einstein's failure wasn't in math or science. It was in conforming to a world that couldn't keep up with the way his mind worked. So next time someone tells you Einstein failed at school, you'll know the truth. He didn't struggle with the work. The struggle was making everyone else understand just how ahead he really was. The image of the Wild West as a lawless free-for-all, where gunfights erupted daily and outlaws ruled the streets, is etched into our collective imagination thanks largely to Hollywood. But the reality, many frontier towns were far more orderly than modern cities, with homicide rates that would seem downright peaceful by today's standards. Take Dodge City, Kansas, often portrayed as the epitome of chaos. Historical records show it averaged just 1.5 murders per year during its peak as a cattle town. Compare that to the modern homicide rate of cities like St. Louis or Baltimore, and suddenly the Wild West starts looking more like a marketing gimmick than historical fact. So how did this myth of non-stop violence take hold? Blame the dime novels of the late 19th century. Publishers like Beadle and Adams churned out sensationalized tales of frontier life, turning figures like Billy the Kid and Jesse James into larger-than-life antiheroes. These stories sold like wildfire to Eastern audiences hungry for adventure, creating a demand for ever more dramatic portrayals. By the time Hollywood got its hands on the genre, reality had been left in the dust. Directors staged elaborate shootouts and saloon brawls because they looked exciting on screen, not because they reflected everyday life. The truth was far less cinematic. Most frontier towns had strict gun control laws requiring visitors to check their firearms with the sheriff upon arrival. Tombstone, Arizona, home of the famous OK Corral shootout, actually banned carrying weapons in city limits entirely. What gets lost in all this myth-making is the quiet resilience of frontier communities. While movies focus on lone gunslingers, the real heroes were the teachers, merchants, and homemakers building schools, churches, and libraries. Towns like Deadwood and Abilene had thriving literary societies and theater troupes. Women played pivotal roles as entrepreneurs and activists, with figures like Nellie Cashman running successful businesses and advocating for miners' rights. Even the iconic cowboy was less a reckless drifter and more a seasonal worker, often an immigrant or black laborer who spent most of his time herding cattle, not dodging bullets. The numbers tell a revealing story. Historian Roger McGrath's research on Bodie, California, a notorious mining boomtown, shows its murder rate peaked at around 116 per 100,000 people during its wildest years. That's high, but still lower than modern-day Detroit or New Orleans, and most frontier settlements never came close to those numbers. The real violence tended to cluster in specific contexts: mining camps flush with gold rush cash or railroad construction sites rife with labor disputes. Your average farming community more likely to see disputes settled in court than at gunpoint. This misconception matters because it distorts how we understand America's past. The Wild West wasn't a Hebesian war of all against all. It was a place where diverse groups forged fragile systems of cooperation. Vigilante justice did exist, but so did jury trials and elected sheriffs. Lynchings occurred, but so did civil rights advances, like Wyoming granting women the vote in 1869, decades before the rest of the nation. When we reduce this era to gun smoke and anarchy, we erase the ordinary people who turned rough settlements into functioning communities. The real frontier wasn't defined by lawlessness. It was defined by the stubborn human instinct to create order, even in the most unforgiving landscapes. So next time you watch a cowboy duel at high noon, remember, the West wasn't won by outlaws. It was built by neighbors. Picture this scene: decadent Roman aristocrats lounging on couches, gorging on roasted peacock and honeyed wine until they can't take another bite, then excusing themselves to a special room to vomit it all up and start over. It's a grotesque image that's been repeated everywhere, from history textbooks to TV dramas. But here's the stomach-churning truth. There's zero archaeological or historical evidence that the ancient Romans actually did this. The whole idea hinges on a modern misunderstanding of one Latin word, vomitorium. Contrary to popular belief, a vomitorium wasn't some VIP puking lounge. The term referred to the wide, arched passageways in amphitheaters and stadiums designed to spew forth crowds efficiently after events. Ancient architects like Vitruvius wrote about these exits in meticulous detail, praising their engineering for moving thousands of people without bottlenecks. The word's connection to vomiting is purely metaphorical, like saying a subway station disgorges commuters during rush hour. So how did this architectural term get twisted into a tale of imperial excess? Blame a mix of Victorian-era moralizing and a misreading of Roman satire. The real roots of the myth trace back to writings like Petronius Satyricon, a 1st century AD satire mocking the vulgarity of Rome's nouveau riche. In one infamous banquet scene, a character named Trimalchio hosts an absurdly lavish dinner where guests overindulge to comedic extremes. Modern readers took these exaggerated descriptions at face value, missing the joke entirely. Petronius wasn't documenting real behavior. He was writing a biting parody of gluttony and bad taste, the ancient equivalent of a snarky political cartoon. Archaeology further debunks the myth. Excavations of Roman villas reveal dining rooms, triclinia, with elegant mosaics and frescoes, but no designated vomit rooms. Medical texts from the era, like those by Galen, warn against forced vomiting as harmful to digestion. Even Seneca's letters criticizing Roman excess never mention this practice, a glaring omission if it were widespread. The closest thing to post-meal purging: some elite Romans may have used feather ticklers to relieve nausea after overeating, a far cry from the industrial-scale regurgitation of legend. What's fascinating is how this myth persists despite overwhelming counter-evidence. It plays into our modern stereotypes of Romans as decadent, out-of-control hedonists, a narrative that says more about our own anxieties than ancient reality. The truth: Roman dining customs emphasized moderation as much as pleasure. Philosophers like Cicero praised the virtue of temperate meals, and many wealthy households followed strict dining etiquette. The vomiting myth endures because it's a perfect morality tale, a cautionary fable about the dangers of excess, even if it's built on a 2,000-year-old game of historical telephone. Next time you hear someone joke about Roman vomitoriums, you'll know the real story. Those passageways weren't for purging, they were early masterpieces of crowd control. And the only thing getting spewed recklessly, misinformation about the past. The Roaring Twenties came to a screeching halt with the stock market crash of 1929, or so the story goes. We've all heard the dramatic tale: panicked investors jumping from windows, fortunes wiped out overnight, and Wall Street's collapse dragging the entire economy into the abyss. But what if I told you that the crash, while devastating, wasn't actually the root cause of the Great Depression? It was merely the spark that ignited a powder keg of deeper, more systemic failures. The truth is, the Depression was a perfect storm of global trade wars, agricultural collapse, and banking chaos, a catastrophe decades in the making, with roots stretching far beyond New York's financial district. Let's start with the myth itself. The crash did erase billions in paper wealth, but stock ownership in the 20s was largely confined to the wealthiest 10% of Americans. The real economic dominoes began falling elsewhere. In the farm belts of the Midwest, years of overproduction and plunging crop prices had already pushed rural communities to the brink. Farmers, drowning in debt, watched as wheat prices plummeted from over $2 a bushel in 1919 to just 33 cents by 1931. When they couldn't pay their loans, thousands of small banks, many dangerously overexposed to agricultural debt, collapsed like houses of cards. Unlike today's federally insured system, these bank failures wiped out life savings overnight, eroding public trust and freezing credit for businesses nationwide. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europe's post-war economies were unraveling. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed crippling reparations on Germany, destabilizing the continent's financial system. When American banks began calling in loans to cover their own losses after the crash, European nations defaulted, triggering a spiral of protectionist tariffs. The infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, which hiked import taxes to record levels, turned this slowdown into a full-blown global trade paralysis. By 1932, international commerce had shrunk by 66%, strangling industries that relied on exports and deepening unemployment. And then there's the Federal Reserve's catastrophic miscalculation. Instead of pumping liquidity into the economy to stem bank runs, the Fed tightened the money supply, fearing inflation that no longer existed. This aggressive deflationary policy starved businesses of capital just when they needed it most. Even the gold standard, once seen as a pillar of stability, became an anchor dragging economies underwater as nations clung to it instead of devaluing currencies to stimulate growth. The takeaway: the Great Depression wasn't a single event, it was a chain reaction of policy failures, structural weaknesses, and international domino effects. The stock market crash was simply the most visible symptom of a disease that had already infected the global economy. By reducing this complex tragedy to a Wall Street story, we overlook the hard lessons about interdependence, fiscal policy, and the fragility of financial systems. And those are lessons we can't afford to forget, because history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. The idea that medieval knights were so weighed down by their armor they needed cranes to lift them onto their horses sounds like something straight out of a Monty Python sketch, but it's a myth that's been taken seriously for far too long. Modern historians and reenactors have thoroughly debunked this notion, proving not only that knights could mount their steeds without assistance, but that they could do cartwheels, somersaults, and even dance in full plate armor. So how did this absurd image of helpless, clanking warriors take hold? The answer lies in a mix of historical misunderstanding and the exaggerated spectacle of Renaissance-era jousting tournaments. Let's start with the armor itself. A full suit of plate mail from the 15th century weighed between 45 and 55 pounds, comparable to the gear carried by modern soldiers or firefighters. Crucially, this weight was distributed evenly across the body, allowing for remarkable mobility. Replicas tested by museums like the Royal Armouries show that a trained knight could vault into the saddle, climb ladders, and even roll into a defensive position with ease. The joints were articulated like a high-end sports car, with overlapping plates at the elbows, knees, and fingers enabling fluid movement. Far from being a clunky metal prison, well-fitted armor functioned like a second skin, tailored to the wearer's measurements for optimal performance in battle. Now about those saddles. Medieval war saddles weren't the simple, flat seats we see in movies. They were deep, high-backed designs with raised pommels at the front and rear, acting like a secure cockpit for the rider. This structure gave knights leverage to wield lances or swords without toppling over, and it also made mounting far simpler than the myth suggests. Stirrups, introduced to Europe around the 8th century, provided an additional foothold. Paintings and manuscripts from the period consistently show knights swinging onto their horses unaided, often while wearing full harness. The notion that they needed pulleys or hoists would have been laughable to a medieval cavalryman. So where did the crane myth originate? Fast forward to the 16th century, when jousting had evolved from military training into an extravagant spectator sport. Noblemen began commissioning ornate, ceremonial armor, thicker, heavier, and packed with decorative elements for pageantry rather than combat. These suits, sometimes weighing 80 pounds or more, were impractical for actual warfare and required assistance to don. Later historians, conflating this niche tournament gear with everyday battle armor, assumed all knights struggled under similar constraints. The image stuck, amplified by Victorian-era artists who romanticized medieval life as a clumsy, brutish affair. The real irony: knights trained from childhood to move efficiently in armor, practicing drills that resembled acrobatics. Manuscripts like Le Jeu de la Hache detail combat techniques involving leaps, spins, and grapples, all performed in full plate. Modern martial artists recreating these maneuvers report that well-fitted armor feels less restrictive than bulky winter gear. The myth persists because it plays into our stereotype of the Middle Ages as backward and clumsy, but the truth reveals an era of astonishing craftsmanship and physical discipline. Next time you see a movie knight being winched onto his horse like a cargo net, remember, the only thing getting lifted here is the audience's credulity. Hollywood loves a good witch-burning scene, flames licking at a terrified woman's feet as a crowd screams for her demise. It's dramatic, it's visceral. And when it comes to colonial America, it's almost entirely fictional. While Europe's witch trials did frequently end in fiery executions, the infamous Salem witch trials of 1692 followed a different, though no less brutal, script. Every single person convicted was hanged, not burned. This critical distinction gets lost in the pop culture blender, where witch hunts across continents and centuries are mashed together into one oversimplified nightmare. The reason for this difference comes down to legal tradition. In England and its American colonies, witchcraft was treated as a felony under common law, punishable by hanging, the standard penalty for serious crimes like murder or theft. Burning, by contrast, was reserved for offenses like heresy or treason, where the symbolism of purging the crime with fire held religious significance. Across the English Channel, countries like France and Germany operated under different legal codes, with witchcraft often classified as a spiritual crime against God, warranting the more extreme punishment of burning. The sheer scale of Europe's witch panics also fueled harsher methods. Between 1400 and 1700, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft on the continent, compared to a few dozen in the American colonies. But the myth of mass burnings in America persists because it serves a darker narrative. Flames are cinematic. They create instant visual stakes, literally and figuratively. Films like The Crucible and shows like Salem amplify this imagery, blending European and American histories into a single, simplified horror story. Even historical reenactments and Halloween attractions lean into the fiery spectacle because, let's face it, a noose lacks the same visceral punch as a roaring pyre. This conflation isn't just inaccurate, it erases the specific social dynamics that made Salem's tragedy unique. The accused weren't targeted for arcane rituals or pagan worship, but for being outsiders, rivals, or simply inconvenient voices in a rigid Puritan community. Archaeology underscores the disconnect. In Europe, sites like the Bavarian town of Bamberg still bear markers of witch burnings, with charred remnants and execution grounds preserved in the historical record. In Salem, by contrast, the only physical evidence points to Gallows Hill, where the condemned were hanged from a sturdy oak tree. Even the method of execution reflected Puritan pragmatism. Hanging was quick, economical, and required no special equipment beyond a rope and a strong branch. The real horror of Salem wasn't the method of death, it was the speed and chaos of the trials. From accusation to execution, some cases spanned mere weeks, with spectral evidence, dreams, and visions admitted as proof. Neighbors turned on neighbors, families were torn apart, and the panic only subsided when the colony's elite began facing accusations themselves. That's the story we lose when we fixate on fictional flames, the raw, human mess of fear and power that turns ordinary people into persecutors. The next time you see a witch burning on screen, remember, the truth is less about fire and more about what happens when fear ignites a community, and that's a cautionary tale that burns just as bright. The Spanish Inquisition looms large in popular memory as history's ultimate bogeyman, a relentless, blood-soaked machine of torture and terror. But peel back the layers of myth, and you'll find a reality far more bureaucratic than brutal, especially when compared to its European contemporaries. While the Inquisition was undoubtedly harsh, its methods were often less violent than secular courts of the era. So how did it earn such a monstrous reputation? The answer lies in a perfect storm of political propaganda, cultural exaggeration, and a certain British comedy troupe that turned medieval paranoia into a punchline. First, let's dispel the numbers myth. Over its 3.5-century existence, the Spanish Inquisition executed around 3,000 to 5,000 people. A tragic toll, but dwarfed by the secular courts of England and Germany, where witch trials alone claimed tens of thousands of lives. Even the infamous auto da fe ceremonies, often depicted as mass burnings, were more about public penance than execution. Only a fraction of those convicted were handed over to secular authorities for capital punishment. The Inquisition's real weapon wasn't the stake, it was paperwork. Meticulous records show exhaustive trials, appeals, and even rules protecting defendants from false accusations. Torture was used in less than 10% of cases, and never with the creative sadism of, say, the French monarchy's wheel or the Venetian Republic's iron cages. The Inquisition's infamy owes much to its enemies. Protestant reformers in the 16th century had a vested interest in painting Catholic Spain as a land of fanaticism, circulating lurid pamphlets filled with exaggerated tales of screaming victims and smoldering pyres. These stories spread like wildfire, amplified by political tensions during the 30 Years' War. By the Enlightenment, philosophers like Voltaire seized on the Inquisition as shorthand for religious oppression, polishing its legend into a cautionary tale against dogma. Fast forward to the 20th century, and Monty Python's absurdist sketches complete with red-robed clerics shouting, "Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition," cemented its reputation as a comically over-the-top nightmare. But the truth is more mundane. The Inquisition was above all a legal institution. Defendants had the right to counsel, could present witnesses, and even received copies of the accusations against them. Privileges unheard of in many secular courts. Its targets were often conversos, Jewish converts, and Moriscos, Muslim converts suspected of practicing their faiths in secret, not random peasants accused of witchcraft. And while its religious zeal was undeniable, its violence paled in comparison to events like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, where thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in streets. What's fascinating is how this myth endures despite centuries of scholarship debunking it. The Inquisition became a canvas for every generation's fears, first of Catholicism, then of authoritarianism, and finally of institutional power run amok. The real story isn't about unmatched brutality. It's about how history gets reshaped by winners, storytellers, and comedians. So next time someone invokes the Spanish Inquisition as the pinnacle of cruelty, remember, the scariest thing about it wasn't its methods, but how easily its legend outran the facts. The Trojan horse is one of history's most iconic symbols of deception, a massive wooden gift hiding an army within, waiting to strike. But here's the twist: archaeologists have yet to find a single scrap of evidence that it ever existed. Not a splinter, not a carving, not even a contemporary account outside of Homer's Odyssey. So was this legendary ruse just poetic fiction, or could it represent something far more intriguing about how ancient civilizations remembered war and disaster? Homer's epic paints the horse as a literal weapon crafted by the Greeks to trick the Trojans into bringing their doom inside the city walls. But dig deeper into the historical context and alternative theories emerge. Some scholars argue the horse might have been a metaphor for siege engines, like battering rams covered in damp horsehide to protect against flaming arrows. Others propose it symbolized earthquake damage. The god Poseidon, often associated with horses, was also the deity of earthquakes, and Troy's layers of ruins show signs of seismic destruction around the time of the legendary war. Could the story be a mythological mash-up of real events, a collapsing wall reinterpreted as divine betrayal? Even the geography raises questions. Troy's excavated lower city reveals cramped streets and modest gates, making it unlikely a giant wooden horse could have rolled in unnoticed. But here's where the myth gains new depth. Ancient Near Eastern cultures, including the Hittites, Troy's likely allies, used animal metaphors in military jargon. A horse might have been code for a secret tunnel or a traitorous faction, something invisible to archaeology but preserved in oral tradition. The lack of physical evidence doesn't mean the story is pure fantasy. Later writers like Virgil and Quintus Smyrnius embellished the tale, but its roots may lie in a real stratagem. The Bronze Age was rife with clever siege tactics, from the Assyrians' use of poisoned wells to the Hittites' nighttime assaults. What if the horse was a narrative shorthand for a breakthrough moment, a blend of engineering and espionage that morphed into legend over centuries of retelling? What's fascinating is how the myth endures despite its shaky foundations. The Trojan horse has become shorthand for subterfuge in everything from cybersecurity to political scandals. Its power lies not in its historicity but in its symbolism, the idea that trust can be weaponized and that victory often goes to those who outthink, not just outfight, their enemies. So was there ever a wooden horse at Troy? Probably not. But the real story, how a simple metaphor could outlast empires, is its own kind of marvel. One of the most persistent conspiracy theories claims the 1969 moon landing was an elaborate hoax filmed on a soundstage. But the evidence supporting humanity's giant leap is as solid as the lunar rock samples brought back by the Apollo astronauts. Let's start with the reflectors. When Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin planted the lunar laser-ranging retroreflector on the moon's surface, they left behind a piece of technology so precise that scientists to this day bounce lasers off it from Earth to measure the moon's distance. These reflectors, still functional after 5 decades, couldn't have been placed by an unmanned probe. Their alignment requires manual positioning, something only human hands could achieve in the moon's low gravity. Then there's the testimony of thousands. Not just NASA engineers and astronauts, but also independent tracking stations worldwide, including the Soviet Union's America's Cold War rival. At the height of the space race, the USSR had every incentive to expose a fake landing. Yet their scientists confirmed they tracked Apollo 11's journey using radio telescopes, even publishing their findings. If the mission had been staged, Soviet propaganda would have screamed it from the rooftops. Instead, they quietly acknowledged the achievement, a silent nod to the undeniable. Photography skeptics often point to anomalies, like the flag appearing to wave in a vacuum or the lack of stars in lunar sky photos, but these have straightforward explanations. The flag's rippling comes from its wrinkled material and the astronauts twisting the pole into the ground, not wind. As for the stars, the moon's surface reflects so much sunlight that cameras had to use fast exposures, making faint stars invisible, just like trying to photograph a candle next to a spotlight. Even the crosshairs that appear behind objects in some photos are simply overexposed areas where bright surfaces bleach the delicate reticle lines. Why does this myth endure? Partly because the scale of the achievement feels unreal, a triumph so monumental it strains belief, but psychology plays a role too. Conspiracy theories thrive on distrust of authority, offering a seductive narrative where secretive elites control the truth. The moon landing became a canvas for these fears, especially during the turbulent late 1960s, when faith in institutions was crumbling. Ironically, the very transparency of the mission, its live broadcasts, its global verification fueled suspicion, as if such openness must be hiding something. The most compelling proof, though, lies in the lunar samples. Over 800 pounds of moon rocks, chemically distinct from Earth minerals and bearing unique isotopes from solar wind exposure, have been studied by scientists worldwide. These weren't created in a lab, they're geological time capsules, some older than Earth itself. No Hollywood set could replicate 4.5 billion years of cosmic history. The moon landing wasn't just a technical marvel, it was a testament to human curiosity, one that left footprints even the most determined skeptics can't erase. The image of medieval knights locking their wives into iron chastity belts before heading off to war is as pervasive as it is grotesque, a symbol of patriarchal control seared into popular culture. But here's the surprising truth. Historians have found no credible evidence these devices were ever used in the Middle Ages, the few surviving examples in museums. Nearly all are either Renaissance-era satirical props or outright 19th-century forgeries, crafted to titillate Victorian audiences hungry for scandalous medieval curiosities. Let's start with the logistics. A genuine chastity belt, assuming one existed, would have been a nightmare of impracticality. Iron rusts and constant contact with skin would have led to horrific infections within days. Even the most basic bodily functions would become agonizing or impossible without frequent removal, making long-term wear untenable. Medical texts from the period never mention such devices, despite detailing treatments for far more intimate ailments. And consider the social reality. Most medieval women worked alongside men in fields, workshops, and markets. Confining them to metal underwear would have been as economically crippling as it was absurd. So where did the myth originate? The earliest known references appear not in historical records, but in 15th century satirical writings. A 1405 manuscript by Conrad Kaiser, a military engineer, includes a crude sketch of a chastity belt alongside fantastical inventions like flying machines, clearly intended as tongue-in-cheek commentary on jealousy, not actual technology. Later, Renaissance artists like Pietro Aretino used the idea in erotic literature, playing it for laughs rather than historical accuracy. By the 1800s, museums eager to attract visitors began displaying antique chastity belts, many of which were later exposed as modern fabrications. The British Museum's infamous example, once touted as medieval, was revealed to be an 1856 creation. its intricate lockwork far too precise for pre-industrial craftsmanship. The real irony, the chastity belt's popularity as a historical myth says more about later societies than the Middle Ages. Victorian moralists obsessed with female purity projected their anxieties onto the past, creating a fictional era of draconian control. Even today, the myth persists because it fits a convenient narrative that medieval people were backwards and cruel, a foil to our enlightened modernity. But the truth is far more revealing. The chastity belt wasn't a tool of oppression. It was a punchline, a cautionary tale, and finally, a hoax, and that's a story worth unlocking. The Emancipation Proclamation is often remembered as the moment America finally ended slavery, a sweeping declaration that shattered chains across the nation. But the real story is far more complicated, and it reveals a strategic move in the brutal chess game of the Civil War rather than a universal act of liberation. When Abraham Lincoln signed the proclamation on January 1, 1863, it didn't free a single enslaved person in Union-controlled territory. Instead, it applied exclusively to Confederate states, targeting rebel strongholds where Lincoln had no actual authority to enforce it. The document was less about immediate freedom and more about destabilizing the South's economy, stripping them of their labor force, and inviting enslaved people to flee toward Union lines where they could join the fight against their former enslavers. Why leave so many in bondage politics? Lincoln needed to keep border states like Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware slaveholding regions that hadn't seceded from joining the Confederacy. Freeing their enslaved populations outright could have pushed them into rebellion, tipping the war's balance. Even in the South, the proclamation excluded areas already under Union control, like parts of Louisiana and Virginia. The irony, enslaved people in those regions remained trapped in legal limbo, their fates tied to military victories rather than moral decrees. The real end of slavery came not with Lincoln's pen but with the 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, 8 months after the war ended. This was the legal knockout punch, abolishing slavery everywhere in the United States, no exceptions. Unlike the Emancipation Proclamation, which was framed as a wartime measure, the amendment permanently erased the institution from the Constitution. Yet even this victory had a dark footnote. The amendment's loophole allowing forced labor as punishment for crimes would later fuel systems like convict leasing, where Black Americans were arrested on petty charges and leased to plantations and mines under brutal conditions. What's often forgotten is the courage of those who freed themselves. Thousands of enslaved people fled to Union camps the moment Northern troops neared their plantations, forcing Lincoln's hand and proving that freedom wasn't a gift from politicians. It was seized by those who risked everything. The Emancipation Proclamation wasn't the happy ending we imagine. It was a war tactic. The 13th Amendment was the law, but the true heroes were the ones who refused to wait for either. Their defiance rewrote history, proving liberation is never given, it's taken. And that's a truth no proclamation could ever contain. The idea that medieval Europeans wallowed in filth, never touching water except by accident, is a grimy smear on history itself, one that says more about Victorian hang-ups than actual medieval habits. Far from being a stinking, unwashed mob, people of the Middle Ages valued cleanliness in ways that might surprise you. Towns across Europe boasted public bathhouses so popular they became social hubs, where neighbors soaked together in massive wooden tubs, sipped ale, and even conducted business deals. London alone had over 18 bathhouses by the 12th century, and Parisian records from 1300 mention steam baths with separate hours for men and women. These weren't crude pits of murky water. Many bathhouses employed attendants to scrub backs, provide fresh towels, and even offer medicinal herbs for the steam rooms. Soap making was a thriving trade, with surviving recipes from as early as the 9th century detailing mixtures of animal fats and ash for basic cleaning, or luxury versions scented with lavender and rosemary for the wealthy. Monasteries preserved Roman bathing traditions, with some abbots insisting monks bathe at least once a week, a frequency that would shock many 18th century Europeans. Even the humble peasant wasn't as grubby as you might think. Diaries and household accounts mention regular washing of hands, face, and feet, especially before meals. Farmers working the fields might not have bathed daily, but they certainly rinsed off sweat and grime in nearby streams or with basins of water heated by the hearth. The myth of medieval dirtiness really took hold much later during the Victorian era, when public baths had fallen out of fashion due to a mix of puritanical prudery and misguided medical theories. 19th century doctors warned that bathing opened pores to miasmas, invisible disease clouds, leading many to avoid immersion entirely. This shift created a false contrast between enlightened moderns and their filthy ancestors. But the medieval world had its own temporary setbacks. During the Black Death, some physicians did advise against hot baths, fearing they unbalanced the body's humors. This was a panic-driven exception, not the rule, and even then, people still washed with vinegar-soaked cloths or herbal rinses to ward off plague. Archaeology adds another layer to the story. Excavations of medieval homes reveal combs, ear scoops, and even tweezers, proving grooming was a priority. Cities like Cologne had sophisticated aqueducts feeding public fountains where people drew water for washing. The real irony, many medieval Europeans would have wrinkled their noses at the hygiene habits of later centuries, when perfume often masked unwashed bodies and chamber pots were dumped straight into the streets. The next time you picture a medieval peasant, don't imagine a dirt-caked recluse. Think of a soap-making, steam-bathing realist who knew the value of a good scrub. And that's a history worth coming clean about. The myth that the Titanic was proudly marketed as unsinkable has become so ingrained in popular culture that it's accepted as fact. But dig into the actual historical record and you'll find something startling. White Star Line, the ship's operator, never made such a bold claim in their official advertisements or materials. The closest they came was a promotional brochure describing the Titanic and her sister ships as designed to be unsinkable, a far cry from a guarantee, and buried in technical specifications rather than splashed across headlines. So how did this exaggerated narrative take hold? The answer lies in a perfect storm of survivor guilt, media frenzy, and the human need to make tragedy feel avoidable. In the wreck's immediate aftermath, newspapers scrambled to explain how such a marvel of engineering could fail so catastrophically. The phrase unsinkable began appearing in sensationalized reports, often attributed to anonymous crew members or unnamed experts. The New York Times ran an article just 2 days after the sinking quoting a White Star Line vice president, out of context suggesting the ship was thought to be invulnerable. This distortion snowballed as survivors, grappling with trauma, recalled overhearing crew or passengers using the term casually. By the time official inquiries began, the legend had already eclipsed reality, becoming shorthand for the hubris behind the disaster. What's especially revealing is how White Star Line's actual safety messaging backfired. Their brochures emphasized the Titanic's advanced watertight compartments, which could theoretically keep her afloat with 4 flooded sections. Journalists and passengers interpreted this engineering nuance as absolute invincibility, twisting cautious pride into reckless overconfidence. Even the ship's designers later testified that while they considered her practically unsinkable under normal conditions, no rational engineer would ever claim a vessel was impervious to all harm. The myth persists because it serves a deeper narrative about human arrogance. Describing the Titanic as unsinkable transforms the tragedy into a morality tale, a warning against overestimating technology. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. The ship's fate wasn't the result of mythical overpromising, but of preventable factors like inadequate lifeboats, rushed speed trials, and ignored ice warnings. By inventing the unsinkable tagline, we rewrite history into a simpler fable, one where the lesson is obvious, the harder truth. Sometimes disasters happen not because we tempt fate, but because we cut corners. And that's a reality far more difficult to confront than any myth. The term Dark Ages conjures images of a stagnant, backward era, a grim intermission between the glory of Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance. But this sweeping stereotype crumbles under scrutiny. The label itself was born not from historical analysis, but from the pen of 14th-century poet Petrarch, who coined it as a bitter metaphor. Writing amid the chaos of Italy's civil wars, he contrasted the light of classical antiquity with what he saw as his own dark time, a literary flourish rather than a scholarly judgment. His followers, eager to celebrate the revival of classical learning, latched onto the phrase, framing the Middle Ages as a barren wasteland of ignorance. Modern historians have spent decades dismantling this myth. The medieval period wasn't a cultural desert, it was a greenhouse of innovation. Take architecture. Gothic cathedrals like Chartres and Notre Dame pushed engineering to new heights with flying buttresses and stained glass windows that turned sunlight into theology. Or literature, epic poems like Beowulf and the Song of Roland explored complex themes of loyalty and mortality, while troubadours in southern France invented the concept of romantic love that still shapes Western storytelling today. Even science thrived in unexpected corners. Monks like Roger Bacon experimented with optics and empirical observation, laying groundwork for the scientific method centuries before Galileo. The dark narrative also ignores the era's global connections. While Europe's kingdoms were consolidating, the Islamic Golden Age was in full swing, with scholars in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo translating and expanding on Greek and Roman texts. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers traded ideas in Spain's bustling translation schools, preserving Aristotle and Ptolemy while advancing mathematics and medicine. To call this period dark is to erase the vibrant exchange of knowledge happening across continents. What's most ironic, many Renaissance thinkers who dismissed the Middle Ages as backward owed their success to medieval groundwork. The printing press, often hailed as a Renaissance invention, relied on paper-making techniques perfected in medieval Arab worlds. Universities, medieval creations became the breeding grounds for humanist thought. Even the very concept of a rebirth presupposes something worth reviving, a debt the Renaissance rarely acknowledged. The persistence of the Dark Ages myth reveals more about our biases than medieval realities. It's a shorthand for progress narratives, a way to paint the past as primitive so the present feels enlightened. But history doesn't move in tidy leaps from darkness to light. It stumbles, circles back, and sometimes leaves its brightest ideas in places we least expect. The next time you hear someone dismiss the Middle Ages as a cultural wasteland, remember, the real darkness isn't in the past. It's in the shadows we cast over it by refusing to look closer. The story of Pocahontas saving John Smith from execution, complete with a dramatic, love-stricken embrace, is one of America's most enduring fairy tales, thanks largely to Disney's animated retelling. But the real history paints a very different picture, one tangled with cultural misunderstandings, colonial propaganda, and a glaring age gap that makes the romanticized version not just inaccurate but deeply uncomfortable. Let's start with the basics. When Smith claimed Pocahontas intervened to save his life in 1607, she was only 10 or 12 years old, while he was a 28-year-old mercenary with a penchant for self-mythologizing. The idea of a romance between them isn't just unlikely, it's a fabrication that emerged centuries later, long after both were dead. Smith's own writings reveal inconsistencies that undermine the tale. In his earliest account of the incident, written in 1608, he makes no mention of Pocahontas at all. It wasn't until 1624, 17 years later, after Pocahontas had become famous in England as the baptized Rebecca Rolfe, that he suddenly inserted her into the story as his savior. Even then, he describes her as a child who laid her head over his to prevent his supposed execution, a gesture that modern scholars argue was likely a ritual act of adoption or diplomacy, not a spontaneous act of affection. In Powhatan culture, incorporating outsiders into the tribe through symbolic rescues was a well-documented practice, a way to establish alliances or assert dominance. Smith, with his limited understanding of indigenous customs, may have misinterpreted this ceremony as a personal act of devotion. The myth's staying power owes much to the way it's been weaponized over time. In the 19th century, as America expanded westward, the story of Pocahontas choosing assimilation over her own people became a convenient allegory for manifest destiny, proof, in the eyes of settlers, that native cultures would naturally submit to European superiority. This narrative erased the brutal reality of Pocahontas's later life. Kidnapped by the English at age 16, held for ransom, forcibly converted to Christianity, and paraded through London as a curiosity before dying at 21 far from home. The real tragedy isn't a forbidden love story. It's the erasure of a girl's agency, her culture, and her untimely death in service of colonial propaganda. Disney's version doubles down on these distortions, aging Pocahontas into a voluptuous young woman who shares a kiss with Smith amid glowing willow trees. The film even invents a magical spiritual connection between them, implying their bond was fated, a narrative that romanticizes conquest as destiny. But the truth is, there's no record of Pocahontas and Smith having any meaningful relationship beyond that one contested encounter. By the time she married Englishman John Rolfe, Smith had already returned to England, where he spent years embellishing his adventures to sell books. The real Pocahontas wasn't a love-struck heroine. She was a child caught in the crossfire of clashing empires, a diplomatic pawn whose story was rewritten to suit the needs of those who conquered her people. Reducing her legacy to a fairy tale romance doesn't just whitewash history, it silences the complexities of indigenous resistance and survival. So next time you hear someone reference the love story of Pocahontas and John Smith, remember, the most powerful myths aren't the ones that entertain us. They're the ones that keep us from seeing the past clearly. The Boston Tea Party wasn't really about tea prices at all. In fact, the tea sitting in Boston Harbor that night in 1773 was actually cheaper than usual thanks to a new tax break. The real outrage wasn't over how much colonists were paying, but who was making the rules. At the heart of the protest was a far more explosive principle: taxation without representation. But even that phrase doesn't capture the full picture. This was also a revolt against corporate monopoly, with the British East India Company playing the villain in a drama that reshaped history. Here's what most retellings miss. The Tea Act of 1773 didn't raise taxes, it lowered them. Parliament slashed duties on tea shipped directly from Britain, allowing the East India Company to undercut prices offered by colonial merchants and smugglers. On paper, colonists could now buy legal tea for less, but the catch: this bargain came with strings attached. By granting the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales, Britain wasn't just dictating what Americans paid, they were handpicking who profited. Local merchants who'd built their livelihoods on trade suddenly faced financial ruin, and there was an even darker implication. If Parliament could prop up one corporation with special privileges today, what stopped them from doing it with other goods tomorrow? The men who tossed 342 chests of tea into the water that December night weren't just angry consumers. They were business owners, thinkers, and activists who saw the Tea Act as a Trojan horse. By accepting cheaper tea, they'd implicitly acknowledge Parliament's right to control colonial commerce without their consent. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty framed it as a moral stand, not over pennies but over self-governance. The tea itself became a symbol, Destroying it wasn't vandalism, it was a calculated act of defiance against an economic system that treated colonies as piggy banks, not partners. Modern textbooks often reduce the Tea Party to a simple tax revolt, but the real story is richer and more relevant than that. This wasn't just about what was in the tea, but who held the power to decide its fate. When we strip away the nuance, we miss a crucial lesson. Revolutions aren't sparked by cost alone, but by who gets to control the ledger. And sometimes the most powerful protests aren't against high prices, but against the quiet erosion of choice. That's the bitter truth behind the Boston Tea Party, one that still resonates wherever people fight to have a say in the systems that govern them. Hollywood loves to paint the Colosseum sands red with blood, showing gladiators butchering each other in every match, but the truth is far less lethal. These warriors weren't disposable pawns, they were premium athletes trained like modern sports stars and worth the equivalent of today's pro football players. Killing them off would have been as financially reckless as a team owner shooting their own quarterback after a bad game. Archaeological evidence, from medical tools designed for gladiator wounds to graffiti tallying one fighter's 56 victories, proves most survived their careers, stepping out of the arena gates alive more often than not. The real economics of gladiatorial combat reveal a system closer to WWE than Mad Max. Training a single fighter took years and cost a fortune. Lannister gladiator managers invested heavily in specialized diets, barley and bean heavy for endurance, expert physicians, and even massage therapists to keep their human assets in peak condition. Contracts from Pompeii show fighters were leased for events with strict penalties for accidental deaths, and tombstones boast of retirees who'd fought 30 bouts or more. One inscription in Turkey memorializes a gladiator who lived to 70, his epitaph noting he'd won many crowns before dying peacefully in bed. Rules tightly governed matches to prevent unnecessary slaughter. Referees oversaw bouts, stopping fights when a combatant was clearly defeated. Mosaics depict gladiators raising a finger to signal surrender, much like a boxer's towel thrown in today. The famous thumbs down signal for death, it was likely rare and possibly a mistranslation. Some historians argue Romans gestured with a closed fist, spare him, or thumb to the throat, finish him, but even then, the crowd's bloodlust wasn't always indulged. Emperors like Marcus Aurelius passed laws requiring approval from match organizers before any fatal blow, turning death matches into expensive special events rather than daily occurrences. Medical care further underscores how valued these fighters were. Excavated gladiator bones show precise surgical cuts, evidence of skilled doctors treating wounds with techniques ahead of their time. A specialized hospital in Ephesus housed gladiators recovering between matches, complete with bone-setting tools and herbal antiseptics. Skeletons reveal healed fractures and even prosthetic limbs, proving these men were patched up and sent back to fight again. Compare that to regular Roman soldiers who often lacked such elite medical attention, and it's clear gladiators received VIP treatment because they were investments, not cannon fodder. The myth of non-stop slaughter says more about modern sensationalism than ancient reality. Just as we exaggerate Viking brutality or medieval torture, we've turned gladiators into one-dimensional symbols of savagery. But the graffiti scrawled on Pompeii's walls tells a different story, fans debating fighters' techniques like modern sports analysts, or cheering a local hero who'd 112 drawn 9. These were stars, not sacrifices, so next time you see a movie gladiator fighting for his life in every scene, remember, the real ones were far more likely to retire with a pension than perish in the dust. Their greatest threat wasn't the arena, it was bad Hollywood history. Imagine calling the entire 20th century the airplane age and treating the Wright brothers' first flight, the moon landing, and modern drone warfare as one undifferentiated blur. That's essentially what we do when we lump the entire Middle Ages into a single stagnant block. spanning roughly 1,000 years from the 5th to 15th centuries. This era wasn't a monolith, it was a dynamic tapestry of upheaval, innovation, and reinvention, with three distinct sub-periods that reshaped Europe in radically different ways. The early Middle Ages, 500 to 1000 AD, were less about knights and castles than survival and synthesis. With Rome's collapse, Europe fractured into a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms, where warlords like Clovis of the Franks blended Roman law with tribal customs. Far from a cultural wasteland, this was an era of quiet metamorphosis. Monasteries like Ireland's Clonmacnoise became islands of learning, preserving not just Christian texts but works of Virgil and Aristotle. Viking raids may dominate popular imagery, but their ships also carried silver from Baghdad to Dublin, weaving Europe into global trade networks even as kingdoms struggled to rebuild roads and aqueducts left to crumble. Then came the High Middle Ages, 1000 to 1300, when Europe hit its stride. The feudal system, often oversimplified as a rigid pyramid, actually fostered surprising mobility. Stone castles mushroomed across the landscape, not just as fortresses, but as economic hubs where peasants paid rent in cheese or chickens rather than military service. Universities in Bologna and Paris formalized education, while Gothic cathedrals soared skyward thanks to engineering breakthroughs like ribbed vaults. This was the age of Elena of Aquitaine ruling both France and England, of the Hanseatic League's bustling Baltic trade, and of Thomas Aquinas reconciling faith with Aristotle's Logica, hardly the dark stagnation of legend. By the late Middle Ages, 1300 to 1500, the seeds of modernity were sprouting. The devastation of the Black Death in 1347 didn't just kill millions, it shattered the old order, sparking labor shortages that empowered serfs to demand wages and rights. Centralized monarchies like Tudor England and Valois France began eclipsing feudal lords, while the Italian city-states birthed the Renaissance by blending medieval scholarship with rediscovered classical ideals. Even warfare transformed as English longbowmen at Agincourt proved armored knights obsolete, and the printing press began democratizing knowledge decades before Columbus sailed. What makes this tripartite division so vital is how it shatters the myth of medieval stagnation. The early period's fragility gave way to the high period's confidence, which in turn collapsed into the late period's reinvention. A cycle of death and rebirth that shaped everything from legal systems to art. When we compress these centuries into a single Middle Ages, we erase the Crusader kings who commissioned illuminated manuscripts, the merchant guilds that pioneered international banking, and the peasant revolts that presaged modern democracy. The real medieval world wasn't frozen in time. It was a crucible where the modern world was forged, one turbulent century at a time. The frenzy surrounding December 21, 2012, the supposed doomsday predicted by the ancient Maya, turned out to be one of history's greatest cases of misinterpretation. Far from forecasting global annihilation, the Maya actually saw this date as nothing more concerning than the flipping of a cosmic odometer. The end of one grand cycle in their long count calendar and the smooth transition into another. This misconception took root when modern audiences, steeped in apocalyptic thinking, projected their own fears onto a civilization that viewed time as an endless spiral of renewal rather than a linear march toward destruction. At the heart of the confusion lies the Maya's intricate calendrical system, a marvel of mathematics and astronomy. Their long count calendar measured vast epochs called backtons, each lasting about 394 years. The 13th backton concluded in 2012, but Maya inscriptions describe this as a time of celebration, not catastrophe. A stone tablet from Tortuguero, Mexico, one of the few texts referencing the date, speaks of a deity descending to oversee the transition, akin to a celestial changing of the guard. For context, imagine mistaking New Year's Eve for the apocalypse because the calendar resets. The Maya themselves left behind thousands of future-dated prophecies and astronomical tables extending far beyond 2012, proving they never saw it as an endpoint. The myth's explosive spread reveals more about contemporary culture than ancient wisdom. New Age authors in the 1990s, mixing fragments of Maya cosmology with Nostradamus quatrains and conspiracy theories, crafted a pseudoscientific narrative that went viral. Hollywood blockbusters like 2012 amplified the hype, depicting tsunamis swallowing continents and Yellowstone's supervolcano erupting, scenarios utterly divorced from Maya beliefs. Even reputable media outlets fueled the fire by framing the story as a mystery rather than debunking it outright, creating false balance between scholars and doomsayers. Archaeologists scrambled to correct the record. Dr. William Saturno, who discovered a Maya astronomical mural in Guatemala dating far beyond 2012, compared the panic to assuming your car will explode because the odometer rolls over to 100,000 miles. Meanwhile, modern Maya communities whose ancestors created the calendar found the hysteria both baffling and offensive. Elders in Guatemala's highlands held ceremonies to honor the cycle's completion, emphasizing harmony with nature, not fear. Their perspective mirrors traditional Chinese or Hindu calendars, where cycles reset without apocalyptic baggage. The deeper irony, the Maya were arguably history's most time-obsessed civilization, tracking Venus's orbit with pinpoint accuracy and syncing their rituals to celestial rhythms. Their calendars weren't tools of doom but intricate clocks designed to align human activity with cosmic order. The 2012 frenzy wasn't just a case of lost in translation. It was a collision between a culture that revered time's cyclical nature and a modern world addicted to countdowns and catastrophes. So next time someone claims an ancient prophecy predicts the end, remember, sometimes a calendar is just a calendar, and the only thing ending is our patience for bad history. History isn't just a collection of facts, it's a conversation between what happened and how we remember it. The myths we've unraveled today aren't just harmless mix-ups, they're proof of how easily stories can eclipse reality, bending the past to fit the narratives we find most compelling. Whether it's Napoleon's height, the Viking horns, or the Titanic's so-called unsinkable hubris, these misconceptions reveal something deeper: our tendency to simplify, sensationalize, and sometimes even weaponize history to serve our present-day needs. A single exaggerated tale can outlast centuries of evidence, not because it's true, but because it resonates with our fears, biases, or desire for a tidy moral lesson. But here's the exciting part: every myth debunked is an invitation to look closer. Real history isn't found in textbook soundbites or Hollywood cliches. It's in the messy, contradictory, and often surprising details that primary sources preserve. When we question the stories we've been handed, we don't just correct the record, we uncover richer, stranger, and more human truths. The Library of Alexandria wasn't lost in a single fiery catastrophe, but through generations of neglect. The pilgrims didn't dress like monochrome Puritans, they wore colors that would have made a Victorian blush. These nuances matter because they remind us that the past was as vibrant and complex as our own world, full of people who defied stereotypes and events that refused to fit into simplistic boxes. So what's the takeaway? Be curious, be skeptical. The next time you hear a fact about history, whether it's Marie Antoinette's cake comment or the Iron Maiden's grisly reputation, ask yourself, who benefits from this version of the story? What got left out, and most importantly, whose voices are missing from the conversation? History isn't set in stone. It's a living thing, reshaped with every new discovery and perspective. And that's where you come in. Dive into those primary sources, challenge the myths, and share what you find. Better yet, drop your favorite debunked historical tale in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going. Because the best history isn't about memorizing dates or legends. It's about learning to see the past with clear eyes, one myth at a time.